think everyone is mentioned when you go over their credentials. They say, but really I'm a teacher, which isn't on there sometimes.
Yeah, right, right.
I'm a teacher.
That's what I spent my life doing.
Which
Just
area
had
we
to-
were discussing with the previous partner I had here in this chair, that it is the essence of communication discipline, yes. Promoting communication awareness in this world, mostly through teaching, yes. Should we start?
It's recording now.
It's a recording. All right, well, we can even, yes, pick up from here. We are here with another leader of the seminar in the format of this Hope at Luther conference. The seminar, which is focused on the issues of media, critical theory, and culture. And for those of you who are in journalism and mass media communication, this name will say a lot. Our guest today and now is Professor James Carey, and a scholar and a public figure associated with world journalism. And his list of past and current activities and achievements is very impressive, and that will require some kind of cultural interpretation to explain them, because most of them are of an international scope. But I will, to make it easier for myself, first of all, I will read some of these achievements. So Professor James Carey is a CBS Professor of International Journalism. CBS stands for Columbia Broadcast System, right?
Yes.
One of the basic broadcasting companies in this country, which is, I understand, international right now.
Yes.
Professor James Carey was a director of the Institute of Communication Research at the University of Illinois. George Gallup Professor at the University of Iowa, the Dean of the College of Communication at the University of Illinois, the President of the Association for Education and Journalism, the President of American Association of Schools and Departments of Journalism. The member is the member of the Board of Directors at the Public Broadcasting System currently. The board member of the Peabody Awards for Broadcasting, which I understand is the agency which is giving international awards for the excellence of broadcasting.
That's right.
And in addition, the author of the book Television and Press, Communication and Books, Communication and as Culture, and James Carey, a critical reader. So these are at least some indications of how active our guest has been in the field of mass media communication, and how much he is, at least in my perception, associated as a public figure with the issues that concern all of us as people of the world community. So our conversation today may be very broad in this context of social, philosophical, political issues of the world and the cultures in general. But to begin with, I would like to ask you a question which probably will be a question of many people in my country when they read the name of the seminar that you are leading here. Why are these concepts united in one theme, media, critical and cultural studies? What is it that stands behind this as an approach, and theoretical and methodological?
Well, I think that what probably distinguishes it is this. I'm one of those people who was trained in economics and came into communications because I was interested in problems of the economics of communications, problems that are raised by the economics of newspapers and broadcasting organizations and all. And so much of my early work in particular had been trying to deal with how these things get priced and sold, these objects, stories, videotape on a national and international market. But I was really interested in it, and this is the critical and cultural part of it. I was interested in it because the media of communication, whatever else they are places, sites, if you will, buildings, where some of the most powerful forces remaking the world are found. Forces which are economic, political, cultural in the broad sense. This is a place in the United States, for example, not only where the media are central to the economy through advertising, through a variety of other means, central profit-making institutions, but there are also places where we conduct our politics, decide who we're going to elect or not elect, campaign. And they're also cultural in the sense that it's also the place where most of us learn what's going on in the world. We learn about it, of course, in education as well. But on a daily basis, we find out what's happening here, there, and everywhere else by watching the news and the entertainment, the documentaries that appear on television or in newspapers or in magazines. And so my interest is in all of these things, and in economics, politics, and culture as they exist within the media of communication. I'm trying to study now, as many people are, issues of globalization, because I'm interested in what happens when national media, the American Broadcasting Company or the British Broadcasting Company, all of a sudden leap the boundaries of their own nation and start speaking to the world, try to include everyone in one way or another, as many as possible, in who they're speaking to. What problems does this raise in the international economy? Obviously, the United States is a great exporter of these materials. We sell them on the international market. Movies, television programs, the Associated Press wire services, sort of thing. And so they leap the boundaries into the world economy, not just the national one. And they also leap the boundaries into world politics and into world culture, in the sense that much of what we know of one another, those who live far apart geographically and don't have contact with one another on a daily basis, we know because we read about it. We read about Russia in the newspapers. We watch films that are made which involve Russia in one kind of story and another. And we see if American television or American newspapers or magazines are being read and watched at other places in the world. And so what I mean by cultural and critical is studying very wide general problems in the way the world gets organized and conducts its business every day through these instruments of communication. And that makes it somewhat different than studying the engineering of it. How do you get a message from point A to point B at the lowest cost and the most efficient way? Or how these things are instruments of persuasion as well. That's not my central focus, but it is on these larger questions of economics, politics, and culture.
Am I right thinking that this critical approach and looking at media as influencing and sometimes manipulating social situations in today's world, all that power that media has. That approach to look at media is rooted in neo-Marxist traditions of media being as one of the modern institutions of structuring where we are going and how we are interacting with the rest of the world.
Sure.
So it's basically a critical tradition that goes back to, in a way, to Marxism.
Well, at least in this sense, is that the first group of people to say they were doing critical communications research were in general European emigres who came here at the time of World War II, and they were generally Marxist or neo-Marxist, and they brought with them that tradition from Europe. There are, however, critical traditions in addition to Marxism.
Right.
American pragmatism is, for example, a philosophical approach that shares many things in common, qualities in common with Marxism or certain branches of Marxism, but has a kind of distinctly American flavor to it at the same time. It's a little more homegrown than others. So that you will find people who will say, I'm doing critical cultural work, and who are not necessarily Marxist or neo-Marxist. Let me give you an example. It is frequently true today, maybe not in Russia, but maybe, where newspaper editors throughout the world will begin their day by going on the World Wide Web and reading the homepage of the New York Times to say, what does the Times think is important today? What are they writing about? What are they concerned with? And while one could approach such an issue of the Times in a neo-Marxist way, at the same time, one doesn't have to. One can say the New York Times has immense influence on the world of journalism, let us say, without necessarily subscribing to a model of class conflict or even national conflict. You could try to look at it in some other way as the worldwide reach of communications, which sometimes comes to us from, quote, socialist organizations. The BBC takes itself to be a public service social organization, not private capital. And so, but at the same time, many of the things one might say about the BBC, that it reflects a British point of view on events, that it sees the world from a particular standpoint, whose entertainment programs are rooted in British culture, the way Russian novels are rooted in Russian culture. See, so these can be examined and analyzed, but not necessarily in a neo-Marxist framework.
When you mentioned before this idea of growing power of mass media in today's world and its ability to change the modern world, what do you think in this respect about the Russian media? And I don't know how much you might know about that, the role of media in today's, what you would call transitional Russian society.
Yes.
And its prospects, so to speak.
Well, it won't surprise you to know I knew more about the media in the Soviet Union than I know about the media in Russia. That change is a discontinuity, not only in life in the former Soviet Union, but in our understanding of what is happening. Here's what I would suspect in the long run. No, not tomorrow, not 5 years from now, maybe more than that even, is that there will be an increasing spread of Russian media throughout the world. It will not be limited to the old nations of Eastern Europe that were once under more Soviet control, but we will develop a Russian language television channel in the United States. And that what is programmed on there will be a variety of things, but many of which will be imported from Russia. In New York, where I live, we have the Italian channel, which has got the evening news broadcast of the public service Italian station. We have a Korean channel. We have a Japanese channel. We have the BBC America. And so if you go through a big cable channel system that's got 100 to 200 channels, you will see many of the countries and cultures of the world represented. And while many of their viewers will be emigres who've come from elsewhere, many of them also, I watch Italian television all the time, many of them also will come from the United States, were born in the United States, and have no connection, in fact, to Italy, but for one reason of taste or another, learn to love it the way one may also love French movies or Italian movies or whatever.
This is, if I understand your logic, to me represents a growing need of the Western countries to have Russia represented on the global scope.
Yeah.
But what about, if you can speculate about it, what about the other part of it, the Russian interest, so to speak, in including, embracing the Western representation in its culture? Today, in the morning, for example, you were talking about this dialectical tension which will continue growing between nationalization and globalization.
Mm-hmm.
So what I see in Russia today, partly is a strong trend of what I call nationalization and claiming its identity and trying to assert that national identity. Particularly in the argument that many Russians are making today that the West is colonizing Russia. So there is a strong desire to protect themselves from what they associate with the invasion of the West. That type of broadcasting we have, porno films or films of low quality, or any other representations of mass culture, which from the point of view of a national consciousness or mentality are an intrusion and erosion of the nationality. So from that point of view, there is a growing need to, as I said, to protect ourselves or people in the country from the invasion of the West. How do you look at it?
Well, I look at it as something that is perfectly understandable, and it's understandable far wider than the case of Russia. When trade agreements are executed at these periodic meetings of the major economies of the world, the last and most difficult thing to get agreement on is the trade in movies, television programs, books. That is, things that impinge upon the development of a national culture, or the maintenance of a national culture, or the further development of it. And so that's true if it's the French who are sitting at the table who say, look it, the United States, which is a major exporter of cultural products. Japan may be the major exporter in the world now of automobiles. They are not the major exporter of movies and television programs at all. The United States is. It sells them in a way, the way it sells automobiles. But it's clearly that these things are different. They're not just automobiles or shoes or other things that enter international trade, because they affect not only the economy, but the politics and the culture of the nations that are receiving them. And so one certainly can understand that in the moment, if I'm correct, and if I'm not, you correct me, that in the moment with all the changes of the last decade, when Russian life is being, in some sense, rebuilt and reorganized, questions of Russian culture and identity are centrally important, maybe more important than they are some other places in the world where some of these questions have been settled through one means or another decades ago. So there's a particular phase problem. I'll give you an example. South Korea now has its own television production industry. It was a major importer of American television for years, until its gross national product became large enough that it could afford to make television, which is an expensive thing to make, particularly to make it at a standard of photography and setting and all of these things, which other people in the world would want to make. Now Korea is an exporter of television. It doesn't export a lot to the United States. It exports to China, it exports to Japan, it exports to other Asian countries. And its imports of American material have declined because Koreans would rather watch Korean television than American television if they have a choice. And because of the similarities of regional cultures, other places in the world would prefer to watch the television of their nearer neighbors, as long as they have decent relations with them, their nearer neighbors, than some country halfway across the world whose culture might be quite different. And so there is, if everything goes okay in the way the world develops, and that's what we don't know about, will it go okay, there would be, it seems to me, a long period of cultural protectionism, if you will, that will be entered into. And so issues like Americanization, American movies, American television, its impact on Russia or other countries, will be central matters of public policy and political debate and anxiety. But that may also be a transitory phase dependent upon the development of a new Russian economy that can generate enough national income to support a filmmaking community, effectively a television making community. And then you'll find out is that the French would rather watch French television and the Germans would rather watch German television. That's not to say they don't watch the television of other countries, particularly their neighbors within Europe. But nonetheless, that's what they would prefer to do if given a choice. And so that, culturally speaking, I think, maybe right or wrong, the influence of these American cultural products may be declining in Europe and in Korea and some other places in the world, while still being formidable and difficult in other countries that are in more transitional phases in the life of their own culture and economy.
So yes, here is this direct link between the status of the national culture, national identity, and national cultural product, and the status of economy.
Yeah.
And yes, you say if, and that's a big question.
Yeah.
If Russia goes in that direction where the national economy becomes stronger and it produces enough income to support the national cultural products, including cinematography and media. And this is what remains to be seen, really.
I want to add one other thing to it, is that an even sharper change in some ways in the international flow of cultural or entertainment products is joint production among companies. So if the British Broadcasting System says we want to make a television program, many of its television programs, it will say, I wonder if we can co-produce it with France and Germany, so we have access to these countries, not just Britain. Or they might approach the United States and said, we'll like to make a history of the English-speaking people. It will cost us so many $1 million or pounds. Will you join with us? The United States production company and a British production company to make it. And now the thing becomes not quite American and not quite British. It's in between. It's more ambiguous what it is, because it reflects these two cultures as they work out some kind of compromise about how to tell this story. And so undoubtedly, because the making of films and television over the course of time is expensive and indeed is difficult often to do, even with developed successful economies, people more and more look to joint productions in which costs are shared and the broadcast rights are shared as well.
What you describe again with these examples of joint production, again reinforced to me a thought that you expressed today in the morning keynote speech about inevitability of becoming more and more cosmopolitan in the modern world. But that idea and this tendency applies, it seems to me, more to, again, citizens and economies of the Western countries, while in other parts of the world, like my own country, I say there is a phase for a different tendency to become more and more national and ethnocentric, which is inevitable. So from that point of view, again, that part of the world called Russia would be in opposition to the dynamics of the West. And then again, we really don't know at what point, well, we can predict that the economic strength and blossoming will be the foundation when Russia can also join the rest of the world in its more cosmopolitan and open view and position. But before that, I understand these two tendencies will continue being in opposition. And we can't even say about Russia well, whether it will happen for sure, because of how economic situation seems to evolve in Russia from, as they say, from bad to worse. So the worst scenario, can you look at the worst scenario if in fact the economic growth is not there, but instead there is a growing economic decline? What's the worst scenario for the culture?
Well, I don't know that I can answer that effectively, and maybe in part because I don't doubt for a moment that income and prosperity and these things is going to spread throughout the world. I don't think. Now, it spreads unevenly, in the 1950s, the gross national product of South Korea was the same as Egypt's. Now South Korea is, relatively speaking, a rich country. The Egyptian economy has not grown to keep pace with population increase and other kinds of things. But in general, and I can't speak for the Soviet Union, I mean, excuse me, for Russia, as I couldn't speak for the Soviet Union, my sense is that the general conditions and phases that have affected the world at large will also be true there. My family lived an average life in the United States. I mean, my parents and my grandparents, of 40-some years. They all died in their 40s. I'm going to live to be 80. I'm going to have doubled, most likely, their lifespan in one full generation. Now, the change may not be as dramatic and as remarkable in every country in the world, but I believe everyone in the world is going to live longer. I believe everyone in the world is going to be healthy. I believe that we're going to generate agricultural surpluses all over the world, so that surplus will be a problem, not necessarily scarcity. And while it critically depends on how well countries manage their affairs, they do their business, I don't believe that necessarily the scenario that you painted is the most likely one. I would be enormously surprised, though I understand that it's some time away, and these are going to be hard years, that Russian national income is going to be certainly around what it is throughout Europe, and its productive capacity, and the spread, sale of Russian-made things, in which Russia is particularly good at those things in which it's particularly good, will spread. So I think there are difficulties, but I don't approach them with the kind of pessimism that says, we gotta get into this loggerhead and being stuck. And as I say, I mean, there are parts of the world where the kind of energy and dynamism necessary to make these changes may be lacking. My impression from the outside, and it is from a long way away, is that this energy and dynamism is not missing in Russia. It's there. Now, how soon, in what way, and this sort of thing, that I can't comment on. But I think this development will not be a dead-end street. It will be not one way. That Russia will become more part of a wider community of nations, of a wider economy, and there'll be setbacks in this. There'll be problems, I mean, just as Americans say, my God, why are the Japanese beating us so badly in the making of automobiles? What do they know that we don't? We kind of invented the automobile industry, and now Toyota's the biggest company in the world, not General Motors. Now, so this is an annoyance and a problem, but it's not desperate.
Well, it's good to have this dose of optimism, because in a way I was playing devil's advocate role here, representing one of the national feelings or moods, if you wish, from within Russia.
Yeah.
Yes, and certainly time will be the main judge here. In about 20 years, we will see. And we all want to believe that the hardest times that Russia goes through now will change for the better. So very much I understand these are speculative questions, but what is important for me is to hear your real belief in the energy and the power of the nation, which is going through a hard time.
Can I add
yes.
one thing to that only, because it was part of your originating question? At the same time that nationalism or national identity, the idea of being Russian, is strengthened over the course of time, let us say, it will also have its problems, as we have our problems too, and every country in the world does, is at the same time certain subnational identities are stronger, or at least more visible now than they were a number of years ago. The fact that Spain has joined the European Union and is a much more prosperous country now than it was 20 years ago does not mean that the Basques and the Catalans don't have objections. They are, if anything, much more aware of who they are, which is, of course, Spanish in one sense, but part of a sub-nation in another. And this tension between nation and globe and sub-nation is one of the things that's so necessary to manage politically. And yet, of course, it's difficult at the same time. But it's not impossible. But a lot of awareness has to go into trying to figure out how we do this, so that we avoid some of the more permanent, deep-rooted conflicts which are so much part of the world and have been for a long time.
And again, I think it ties us back to a discussion we had in the morning. So you project this in the broadest sense, the most democratic and embracing the diversity worldview, where you understand the complexity of the world, understand that it is inevitable. But there are other worldviews and political positions where people intentionally want to make it yes or no, true or bad, black and white. I'm speaking about, for example, radicalism and international terrorism.
Yeah.
So those forces will also be growing, and so to deal with that type of a worldview and approach, people who are decision makers in this world, like the government leaders, have to have this kind of worldview calibrating all these nuances. While in today's situation we see the US, for example, and the government leaders, which from the perspective of many people in the world do not demonstrate the recognition of the complexity and the desire to deal with the complexity of the world in a dialectical way. So which again poses a question: how do these democratic and dialectical worldviews have to get more power if at the position of the leaders today we observe something different?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if I answer that directly, you're going to hear me talking about my hopes, what I would like to see happen, as much as what I know will happen. I happen to think, and I hope I'm right about this, that this particular president and this particular regime, if you will, in Washington, is a momentary thing. Now, what will happen in the elections of this year, I don't know. But I don't think it is a permanent expression of American interests and understandings and desires. I think it's a warping of them, and it's done quite deliberately by certain elites. You know, and you don't have to be a neo-Marxist to describe this process, you know, that is, that's there. So, in that case, therefore, I think, I mean, it requires, this is what I mean by the successful management of your affairs. I don't think the United States is successfully managing its place in the world now. And it's damaging itself. It may damage others too, but it's damaging itself. And it's damaging many of the loyalties people have to their own country. None of us likes to go someplace else and have to defend the Bush administration because we're American. When we didn't vote for him, we're going to vote against him again. We're going to try to do something about it. But I don't think it is in the best interest of the United States or of the world to continue this particular regime in power, which I think is narrowly nationalistic as part of its problem. It's not cosmopolitan enough. It's not world-oriented. It's not, in your phrase, appreciative of the complexity of the world that is out there. And you can't deal with a phenomenon of this time in which we're living, like terrorism, the way it's seeking to manage it. It's going to fail at this, and it's going to make things a lot worse in the process. By that, I don't mean that these issues can't be dealt with by another government, by more understanding, by more bilateral and multilateral cooperation. After all, for all the estrangement that has taken place over the last years between the United States and an old ally, France, both countries are vulnerable to terrorism. France has a very particular problem because it is so close to the Middle East and has had such long-term interest in the Muslim world and has such a large Muslim population relative to the nation as a whole. So we have a joint interest in a way, but it's working against one another now, not working with one another. And so all I can say is that's what the challenge is for us. And it's similarly a challenge for other people in other circumstances dealing with the same thing. So we have to strengthen institutions while we are being nationalistic in certain important ways. Russian culture is worth preserving and enhancing, and not to lose it. And so in that sense, yes, but we have to build institutions of collective security, of cooperation, of mutual activity, at the same time that we think seriously about issues of national identity and national literature or national culture.
So again, you look at it more as a deviation from the major cause, I mean, what is happening in terms of politics and administration in the US. And you have the same hope that, yes, the dynamics will change. You mentioned in the morning also responding to a question which was more projecting into the future, what will be happening with the world and in the world. And you mentioned that you see the world in 3 areas. And I was curious about what you meant by those 3 areas. I think one of them is the European Union, the other is Northern American. What would be the third?
Well, I didn't have time to go further with it. 3 is an arbitrary number, and it's probably not enough. But it seems to me that over the course of time, there will be a tendency not just to build more global and multinational institutions of collective security and cooperation, but also new regional alliances in which nations collect themselves for a variety of for reasons, economic and cultural, into groups like the European Union or the Americas or Asian, or Euro-Asian, whatever we want to say, is that part of the world in which Russia exists. And I don't think that Russia is going to be absorbed into the European Union, though it may develop more cooperative and bilateral ties with it in terms of trade and exchange of students and many, many other things. But it seems to me that we're not going to go from nations to the world. We're going to go from nations to regions to the world as a slow evolutionary process. And I mean, that's just my vision of where I think the long-run tendencies are headed. All of these things can be derailed, upset by terrorism, by nations such as the United States and others acting like rogue nations and not doing their work appropriately. All of these things are possible. I don't want to be a romantic, who just says everything's gonna be all right. We got no more problems. We got real problems and real opportunities at one and the same time. And I want to try to underscore both the seriousness of the problems, and because as we found out, again, you would have to answer this question in the case of Russia. I know in the case of the United States that post-1989, post-1991, where there were some people who celebrated what had happened, there were many of us who were very relieved at the lessening of international tensions and the possibilities of our children living safely and growing up and trying to put behind us one phase of history and to go on to something else. Now, if Americans said, oh, well, there are no more troubles in the world, there are no more conflicts, the answer is, of course there are troubles. Of course there are conflicts. Human beings are born to troubles. Be realistic. There are other things out there that can get in the way of our dreams of a more peaceful and equitable world. And we have to pay attention to them. We have to pay attention. The world is not a zero-sum game.
Well, but I view you as still a person who strongly believes in social progress. The course is rough, very difficult,
Sure.
but you're basically an optimist in your vision of where human race is going.
Sure, and I'm also a realist, I think, in trying to understand where it went wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we fought a civil war, you did too. We fought a civil war in the United States over whether we're going to be one nation or two. It was a bloody, long, intractable, and in many ways stupid war. It did not have to go that way, but it got out of hand. So there are dangers, and one should pay attention to them. But the dangers don't overwhelm me or lead me to feel that somehow we've all collectively lost our brains, even if some people sometimes seem to act that way.
From the point of view of this world progress of the human race, or
Mm-hmm.
human civilization, Can you elaborate in some in some aspects on globalization? Because you know that many people, whether it is in the US or in Russia, tend to look at it again in this black and white approach.
Mm-hmm.
It's bad, or what is good about it, not probably considering again the complexity and multiple dimensions of this as an inevitable, that's my perspective on it, as an inevitable process. So, or your thoughts about it?
Well, again, I think about it as an often contradictory and difficult process. If you'll forgive me getting personal, the fact that we could be sitting here in Iowa talking to one
Right.
another about our two countries and how we're going to work together and all is an enormous change, and that's progress over what we had before. I didn't do this 15 years ago, and you didn't do it either. And also that, in fact, this is an aspect of globalization, that both you and I are freer to travel about the world, to consult others, to try to understand our respective countries better, to try to find ways of cooperating with one another in issues of education and understanding. These seem to me to be, in general, just very, very positive developments, and are in general much better than what has come before. At the same time, issues of political integration are very difficult to manage, as we can see in the example of the European Union. The British don't want to adopt the euro. The French don't want to give up too much of their culture to Europe, never mind to the United States. They still want to preserve the French language in the pristine form that they imagine it. Who should set monetary policy in Europe? Should it be the German central bank? The central bank in London? I mean, these are tough issues. And Europe will come together to write a constitution soon to try to resolve some of these and to produce a kind of general agreement with it. And at the same time, we have the mixed arena of economics, in which high levels of cooperation and trade are probably, in general, a force for peace and commonality. And yet the dangers of domination, of exploitation, are still very real and there. And so here too, I feel in a way that a global world in which human identity is not rooted in place as well. My country, my place, where I was born, my family, my civilization. It has to have that element to it, so we know who we are, at least, And at the same time, that has to be a prelude to being able to say, but despite that fact, we can work together. We can work together on political matters. We can work together on economic matters. And in fact, we're doing much more of that now than we have at any time since 1914. Anyway, and in general, that's been good. There are a lot of success stories out there. Whether there have been more success stories than failures, I don't know. I haven't added it all up. But, which means I take an intermediate stamp position of say, globalization in some things, not in everything. Globalization can help us here, but can it hurt us here? And so let's not fall in love with one word and believe that it is intrinsically good or intrinsically evil to adopt it. You know, let's try to make judgments in which there is a kind of mutual regard and mutual respect. Then I suppose, and again, I will to people who see this perhaps back in Russia be taken for too much of an optimist. I've mentioned this to you before as I kind of love the presence of the Russian community in New York. I love to go out to Brighton Beach and Coney Island and to eat in the restaurants and to talk to people who have thick accents that I can't always understand. But you know, I think we're richer because of that. I think we are richer, culturally richer and all, you know, and so I don't fear that sort of thing. And I say that aspect of it, of globalization, seems to me to be generally a good thing to have, as long as the other problems are approached intelligently.
Well, I have many questions of a conceptual nature. Right now, maybe getting back to our initial intention to talk about communication and communication education in today's
Yes.
in modern society. What would you say to my Russian colleagues who are at the beginning of this, I would say, in the shift of the paradigm, where there is an evolving recognition of communication as a power transforming today's institutions and patterns, and yet there is a raising awareness of that, but yet there is a lack of means in doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything you would say to my colleagues in viewing the situation?
I would reiterate in somewhat different language than I used before the following. The intellectual disciplines of the world, whether it's physics or philosophy, or linguistics or psychology, are great human achievements, I believe. And at the same time, I believe also they can do some harm. If they don't allow us to see the world in more holistic terms. And for me, the important thing about the study of communication is in part that it steps outside, to some degree, the established disciplines and says, can I get a better sense of the world and how it's going on in it if I combine things, bring together things that have heretofore been separated. Maybe I'll give you a concrete example that I believe in, but I may be wrong. The modern science is one of the great intellectual accomplishments of the world that's been widely shared in by other cultures. No one owns modern science. Everyone, pretty much everyone, has contributed to it. But modern science came about when a tradition of natural philosophy, speculating about the nature of the cosmos and our place in it, was wedded to the old crafts. And so all of a sudden, a lens grinder is making a telescope for a philosopher. that is to say, the crafts that made things, came together with the philosophers who speculated, and both became more important. The philosophers now had a better way of doing physics because they had adapted many of the tools of the material world to their discipline. And lens grinders revolutionized the world. Who was more important to the rise of science than those who made microscopes and telescopes, optical devices of all kinds? And these were often, as I say, skilled craftsmen. So I don't think that we should be afraid of recombining old things into new things, of saying, wouldn't it be better if we put X together with Y rather than kept them separate? And for me, at least, as you've heard in this discussion, I was trained as an economist, but I got interested in problems economists couldn't solve, didn't have anything interesting to say about, because they're not just economic problems. They're problems of human understanding, they're problems of political compromise and cooperation. And so one had to have, in my view, a wider lens on the world than at that time the existing disciplines allowed. Engineering is a wonderful, wonderful discipline and occupation. Our hopes for engineering in many ways have declined. No one talks about, as the American economist Thorstein Veblen did, the Soviet of engineers, meaning as a new force to remake the world. Engineers should have a wider fix on the world than is permitted by the engineering disciplines as now constituted, for example. And so I think the world of intellect and of understanding improves when we bring together things that were previously separated from one another and see if in their juxtaposition we can understand them. And so much of the study of communication, as I understand it, is bringing together in being assured we'll find better ones tomorrow or the next year, and that our truths, which we think are well justified by all the evidence we can marshal, will be transcended. People will move beyond it. Much as we might say that quantum mechanics move beyond classical mechanics without disregarding it, and that what is believed by physicists in one era is different than what was believed in another era. And while progress is not inevitable, it's never inevitable in any domain, I think intellectual work is that way. I sometimes say truth is a compliment we pay to those beliefs we think are well grounded. We're sure this is the way things work. This is the way quarks behave, right? This is the way social groups struggle with one another. But, to understand, or at least I have to understand, that a new generation of scholars will come along and say, I figured out a better way of thinking about that, a different way, a way that's truer to the evidence, a way that's more comprehensible or comprehensive, a way that can solve all the old problems, but can solve some problems the old ways couldn't solve either. And so that for me is the spirit of pragmatism as I learned it and as I understand it. And well, when I get around to talking about truth, it starts to sound like the relativism
Yeah,
of postmodernism.
Yeah.
I don't actually,
Situated
I don't actually believe that. I believe that there are some things we believe for which we have good warrant on the basis of all the evidence, the best evidence we can gather. But I'm also sure someone will come up with a better answer down the road.
Mhm.
And all of a sudden, what I thought was the final answer, the last answer, the real truth, the principle of the theory that got right to the heart of things, will come along and say, nah, I got a better way of thinking about it.
But I don't see anything wrong with using the word relativism in this respect. That's how, to me, yes, is a valid way to look at temporary utility of the knowledge which serves this particular historical moment. And at a different historical moment, there will be a different theory, different perspective, different knowledge to build on that.
I agree with you, and the only reason I mention it is often when people want to disagree with you, when you take this position, they say, oh, you're a relativist, as if they can dismiss you by calling you that. You say, no, I'm not quite that. I believe we haven't reached the final solution to the mystery of the universe, or the mystery of human nature, or the mysteries of politics and economics. That doesn't mean that I don't think that much of what we believe in these realms today, and for which we have evidence, are not warranted given the present state of things. But I'm quite willing, if someone puts up their hand and says, Professor Carey, I think I found a better way of thinking about that problem, I hope that I remain flexible enough to say, let's hear it. Let's see. Do you really have it? And don't say, no, this way of thinking about the problem is the only way, because it solved all the problems.
To me, it's again a belief in dialectical nature of the world and the inevitability of change. So
yes.
We operate and maybe do our best in understanding and managing the issues we have today, but in the course of the evolution and development and growth, sooner or later we will get to the insufficiency of our tools.
Well, it may be that in putting things this way, in carrying coals to Russia, I don't have to carry there. All I can tell you is that much of the Anglo-American tradition of science said, or intellectual word generally, read Newton. He's got it all. That is a belief in final answers, free from historical, dialectical contingency of a changing world and new demands. And so seeing it that way is important to me because of the situation in which I work and live and what I have to convince people of. I don't think that the laws of markets are the last word in human affairs.
Mm-hmm.
I think we can do a hell of a lot better than that. That doesn't mean I have to throw out every law of markets, cease to believe in supply and demand or liquidity preference functions or how interest rates operate. But I can say that, but I can say this is not. There must be a better way of understanding human economic activity that deals with some of the problems that inevitably come up within a market orientation. I don't know what those better answers are.
I was going to ask you to
Yeah.
hint.
No, I don't know what they are. I know that scholarship is cooperative work with others in which we work together to try to find better answers to them. And that's one of the things you try to do.
Mhm. So again, we're ending on this optimistic note that future generations will benefit from our struggles and searches and findings.
Yes.
Ah,
Well, maybe in part to say, to undergird that the optimism is not unrealistic. Terrible things have happened over the last 500 years. You know, awful things have happened to peoples in the course of it. But at the same time, I believe that, in fact, I know from the evidence, that we've become not only richer, but smarter. We live longer. I mean, real things have happened. And as I said before, the fact that my parents only went to school for a few years, and I got a doctorate, that my parents died at 45, and I'm going to live to be 80. That, for me, is a realistic way to be optimistic, even though we know there are going to be ups and downs and difficulties along the way.
well, let's say this is a general message that I will be glad to share with my Russian partners, colleagues, and simply fellow men and women. Well,
Yeah.
thank you very much.
It's been lovely to talk to you. I've enjoyed doing
Thank you.
it. All right,
The
Michael.
longest talk, yeah.